But we have all of these experiences with him in Babylon as he's trying to serve and grow and live in the midst of captivity. And this is a challenging thing to do. And we're having to try to figure that stuff out ourselves. Of how do we live? How do we operate? How do we function within a nation that does not honor him? And so what we see in all of these types of events are things that God is going to do in the midst of those nations to glorify his name. And those will continue. And we were looking at chapter 7, which was the last chapter in Aramaic. It's in the Aramaic section, but it's when God starts to speak to Daniel correctly. And again, that was one of those passages that is considered one of the more important, more critical chapters for understanding biblical prophecies about the end days, even Revelation. But if you remember chronologically, chapter 7 actually occurs before the events of chapter 5. And we talked about that a bit, how Daniel chapter 7 opens up in the first year of King Belshazzar of Babylon. And Daniel has this dream, he has this vision. And so that's anywhere between 13 or 10 years before the events of chapter 5. And I did want to make one little correction or one alteration about one of the things we were talking about last week with that chiastic structure. Y'all remember that? How the middle of this Aramaic section, the results of pride, rejecting God's supremacy, and those types of things. We looked about it how with all of these, they parallel, and the focal point comes to this section of point number 3, where Daniel interprets Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and then there's the fall of Nebuchadnezzar, and Daniel interprets the handwriting on the wall, and there's the fall of Babylon, and those types of things. I had said that number 3, where is that the great powers of the world can and will be broken by the power in the word of God. What I didn't include, and should have, is that really there's something at the heart of number 3 that's very important, that we never want to lose sight of. And that's in chapter 4, verse 31. Is some of the statements that Nebuchadnezzar makes, where he says, "So I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation." Then he also says in verse 34, "Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, and honor the King of heaven, because all his works are right and his ways are just. He is able to humble those who walk in pride." This is really the heart of what Daniel is wanting to make sure everybody knows and remembers and learns. For as they are going through this world, we don't ever want to forget these things, because we are in the midst of struggle and difficulty and upheaval and political turmoil and wars and rumors of wars and all kinds of things going on in the world. But you don't ever want to let that make you forget that God's dominion will reign forever. You don't ever want to forget that all his works are right. You don't ever want to forget that all his ways are just, and that he is able to humble the proud. So these are truths and all things that all believers must hold close to our heart, especially as we begin to see more and more of these events start to come to pass. So the more that we see happening, the more we need to hold on to this core from Daniel. So never let your eyes, never let the news convince you that God is not in control, that his dominion is ever in jeopardy. Never let your eyes, never let fake news make you doubt that what God is doing is right. All right? No matter what public opinion is, no matter what is declared legal, no matter what is made illegal, never let what happens in these days of fulfillment make you think that God's ways are not just, that living by the word of God is not justice. Because there's a whole conversation about what is justice that's going on, and they're not using the Bible as their foundation. And if they're not using the Word of God as the foundation for understanding justice, are they ever going to get it right? No. And in fact, they will create a more unjust system The further they get away from the Scriptures, the more unjust things will become. So we should understand that and expect that. So never doubt that those who exalt themselves can and will be humbled. Those who walk in pride are those who do what is right in their own eyes, what makes sense to them, who elevate man's ways and man's laws and man's philosophies or concepts over God's ways and His laws. And y'all know this, that pride is the essence of Satan's rebellion against God. And is he going to be brought down? Yes. Yes, he is. So keep those things in mind as we go forward in Daniel. And if Daniel chapter 7 was, in the first year of King Belshazzar, when we start up in chapter 8, it's now switching back to Hebrew, and it's in the third year, making it either 10 or 7 years before Babylon's falls. And so we're looking at some more details. Daniel is giving a little bit more detail of some of these events that are about to pass in chapter 8. So he starts off with, in the third year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after the one that had appeared to me earlier. So in the vision, so this is 2 to 3 years later. In the vision, I saw myself in the citadel of Shushan, that's still, which is in the province of Elam. In the vision, I saw that I was beside the Ulai Canal. This is Susa, still part of Babylon, but it now has a new government. Well, no, he hasn't done that yet. He hasn't got to change the government yet. But so this could be between 10 and 7 years before all of that takes place, before everything falls apart. And it's kind of interesting that either one of those numbers have biblical significance, 10 and 7, right? But if it's 7 years, what do we call that? A 7-year cycle. We call that the Shemitah cycle, right? That's the seasons of planting, when they would then leave the ground unplanted for a year. But that 7 years also reminds us of the time that existed in the book in Egypt, in Joseph's day. With 7 years of abundance, right? And then there was the 7 years of drought. So what Daniel saw was the fall of the nation in just a few years. It's almost like they were standing on that 7 years, and they know that the drought is about to begin. At least Joseph knew that. Maybe other people didn't quite believe it yet, but Joseph knew it was coming. Daniel knows that this is coming in the years ahead. And so what Daniel saw was the fall of this nation to the combined Medo-Persian Empire. But what's interesting is he didn't see it with a name or a flag or a uniform, but he sees it with an animal. So I lifted up my eyes and looked up, and behold, a ram with 2 horns was standing in front of the canal. The 2 horns were long, but one was longer than the other, but the longer one grew up last. He says, I saw the ram charging toward the west, north, and south, and no animal could stand against him. None could deliver from his hand. So he did as he pleased and magnified himself. And so you see that, this is a picture of a ram, something like that. And this is talking about the rise of Persia. Okay, and the 2 horns are the 2 primary regions of the kingdom, the Medes and the Persians. And this, so you're seeing this is, what part of the world is this over here? Modern day? This is modern day Iran over here. This is Iraq. Oh, this is Iraq over here. This is getting over into India, but this is Iran right here. This is Iraq. This is Turkey, getting down into Egypt. Okay, but this idea that this is confirmed about being Persia is later in chapter 8, verse 20. It says, the ram that you saw with the two horns stands for the kings of Media and Persia. And what's interesting is apparently the king of Persia, instead of wearing a crown on his head, he would actually wear a jeweled ram's head of gold instead of a crown. And so that's actually part of, it's seen in the pillars of Persepolis, that he would wear this ram's head instead of a crown. And at first, the kings of the Media were, I guess, the core of the kingdom, but the Persians eventually took over and began to dominate. But the ram, his success caused a problem. If you remember that passage, it says that he did as he pleased. He did as he pleased and magnified himself. Now, what does that sound like? What does that remind you of? Does that remind you to anything about what we were looking at just a little while ago about the core of Daniel? We've learned from the heart of that Aramaic section that walking in pride, which is doing what you want, doing what you please, and exalting and magnifying yourself, that's a recipe for disaster. Right? Because in those that do that, nations that do that, people that do that, will be brought down. And so Daniel already is telling us something. Daniel should already know something about this ram, about this future. The groundwork for its fall is already guaranteed. That's something you need to understand. As it grows and becomes great, its foundation is already starting to crumble. So he says, while I was contemplating this, in verse 5, behold, a male goat came from the west, crossing the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. Now the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes, and he came up to the two-horned ram that I had seen standing beside the canal, and charged it with raging strength. And I saw him attacking the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering his two horns. Now the ram was not strong enough to stand against him, so he knocked the ram to the ground and trampled him, and no one could rescue the ram from his power. So the ram was humbled. It was brought down. And this is some of the artwork, some of the imagery that you might see that's out there trying to depict these types of things. So the ram that took down Babylon is itself taken down sometime later. And this goat, it comes flying in from the west. And it's moving really fast. And it's typically understood this is referring to the nation of Greece, which at the time was not a major power. It would be like us talking about, Canada or something. Make fun of the Canadians a little bit. We can do that. But again, the interpretation given by the angel Gabriel later confirms this. It says, the buck, the male goat, is the king of Greece. The large horn between his eyes is the first king. And who knows the name of this first king of the kingdom of Greece? It's Alexander the Great. So he figures into the biblical narrative. So you see all sorts of different depictions of him. The next one is a mosaic from a larger picture. I don't think I have the larger picture in here. But he was born in the city of Pella in central Macedonia in 356 BC. So he's called the Great for all of his military accomplishments, his strategy, his leadership skills. He became king at the age of 20. So about 336 BC. So again, Daniel goes off into captivity in 605. Babylon falls in 539, about that time period. And he comes to power a couple hundred years later. And at the time of his death, the empire that he had made and covered over 2 million square miles and was the largest empire of the time. Okay, 2 million square miles. Tennessee, by the way, is 42,000 square miles. Texas is 266,000 square miles. So you start looking at that. This one guy, starting over here, went all the way into India. And what's amazing, the United States, without Alaska, is just 3 million square miles. All right? But he did all of this. He came to power at 20. He died at 33. So in 13 years, he did that. I mean, the guy was pretty sharp. By 331, he came to power. In 336, he conquered the coastal city of Tyre, which is over here on the coast just north of Israel. In 332, it took him 8 months because it was an island. He had to build bridges, essentially, land bridges and things out there to get to it. He swept through Israel to Egypt shortly after, and he declared himself Pharaoh by the end of 332. By 331, he had crossed the Euphrates and the Tigris, right up here, and moved toward the heart of Persia. And so he had gained all sorts of wealth and stuff from Babylon, from Susa, and he announced himself the Persian King of Kings. That's a title he took upon himself. He conquered not only by military means, but by culture, and especially language. Y'all have heard in the scriptures they talk about the Hellenism or the Hellenistic Jews. Alexander is the one responsible for all of that. As he came through and conquered the territory, he would impose Greek culture, philosophy, beliefs, and language everywhere he went. And it's the reason why the Greek language was spoken in Judea when Jesus was walking around. It's what made the spread of the gospel, is why it was put into Greek. And it was able to go everywhere because everybody could read it. So language especially was and is a powerful weapon of war and cultural domination. And this is something important for us, and we see this happening now. Control of language, words, and phrases. If you can control that, then you can control how someone thinks or how someone talks about certain topics or about certain people. Right? We see that in our day all the time under the guise of political correctness, cancel culture, news coverage. A couple of examples. When Trump was in office and they had all the children on the migrant border, what did they call that situation when they were holding the children? They called it kids in cages, right? Y'all remember that? Certain very negative language. But now, guess what they call that? They're child detainment facilities or something else. They've completely changed the terminology where one was very negative and one is very positive, or at least neutral. And they can do those kinds of things all the time just with how the phrasing of the language is spoken. And you can control the debate and even the outcome. So Alexander knew and understood that. And he moved as far as over here into the borders of India, which is modern-day Pakistan. And then he dies in 323 back over here in Babylon. He did all of that in 13 years. So this is another picture of that where he is sweeping through all of these different territories, coming down this way before he goes all the way around and finally comes back where he dies. So you have all of this detail about these two nations. And if it was written in the 500s, before Daniel's death, then this is what led most scholars to believe that Daniel was a forgery. They say there's no way. There's no way somebody in the 500s would have predicted Greece to do all of that, to come in and defeat Persia. Yeah, they probably could have got the first one right, with the rise of Persia and that empire, but they probably would not have gotten Greece. And they did, because they didn't, and they still don't believe in predictive prophecy. They don't believe that's possible. They say it could only have been written after all of these events, because everything that this chapter and the following chapters describe is so accurate. So they believe that it was written during this Hellenistic periods in about the 100s or 200s BC, when Greek was the primary language. But there's a lot of reasons to believe and to understand that Daniel was actually written during this time, the stated time. The Hebrew, the Aramaic division, for one thing, the fact that that's in there at all tells you that it was written at a time when Greek was not the primary language, because they would never have bothered to include that. Why include that kind of division if it was written first in Greek? It says the Septuagint was begun in about 260 BC, and it does include some portions of Daniel and some other related things to it, but the translations that are in the Septuagint are considered unreliable. They don't follow exactly what we see in the Hebrew and Aramaic. The earliest copies that we have of the book of Daniel were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. They are in the Hebrew and the Aramaic. They use Hebrew and Aramaic words and phrases from the time before Alexander. Daniel himself mentions Jeremiah, and Ezekiel mentions Daniel in chapter 14 and 28. So there's a lot of reasons to say that Daniel was actually written before the rise of these empires. And there's a lot more that I could say about that, but I'm trying to trim down a little bit. But one thing that we know that happens afterwards is this. It says the male goat, became exceedingly great. But as soon as he became mighty, the large horn was broken. Right? So what happened to Alexander? He dies pretty early on. And in its place, 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. We know that Alexander's empire, after he died, was divided among his 4 generals. And this is a map of that. You have one that takes this original land of Macedonia, one that takes the islands and the different portions of lower Greece and such. Then you have one that gets this whole, you try to hold that whole territory, and then one that's down here in Egypt. This one's the Ptolemaic kingdom, this one's the Seleucid kingdom, and these guys were fighting back and forth trying to control right here. Okay? Y'all with me so far? Two of them fought for control over Israel and over the Jews, and the Jews had been allowed to return by the Persians, and they rebuilt Jerusalem. They rebuilt the temple starting in about 520 BC. They finished the temple in about 515. So everything that happens with Alexander is after Jerusalem has been rebuilt. So you can easily argue what it says here, the 4 horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. You can easily argue this is a way of saying that the kingdoms, just kept trying to expand in all directions. But if we've been here during Daniel and looking at this study, we've already seen that the 4 winds essentially are angelic authorities established by God. Because remember, in the last chapter, they stirred up the chaos of the oceans and brought the beasts out. So they're trying to grow up toward the 4 winds of heaven. I believe that section, it's like it's saying that these kingdoms and authorities are beginning to aspire for status and power that they don't really deserve. above their pay grade. They began to see themselves and their rule as divine, as supernatural. So they began to claim more and more allegiance and devotion and authority from all the people that they were ruling over, right? Authority that rightly belongs to God. So they're growing up, and they're towards the four winds of heaven, because that's what it talks about. They're trying to claim even more. Out of one of them came forth a small horn, which grew extremely large to the south and to the east, and toward the beautiful land. What's the beautiful land? That's Israel. That's the promised land. It grew as high as the host of heaven, and hurled some of the host and the stars down to the earth and trampled them. Here again, they're setting their sights on a land and a people that are God's treasured possession. And they would have to ascend, and when you're talking about it here, they're on the coastline down here, but to get up to Jerusalem, they have to go upwards. They're having to ascend to get into the hill country of Judea, to get into Jerusalem, to assault the temple and the priests. So when it's talking about it grew as high as the host of heaven and hurled some of them down, I believe these statements are more about the people and the temple and the priests who are part of God's hosts and his representatives. And we read about Antiochus. We read about how he comes out, and he does much of this in about 170 to 164 BC. It's a period of about 6 years where he's desecrating the temple, where he is proclaiming himself a god. He's putting up an idol, and he's calling himself the prince of the host. He's taking the powers. He's trampling over God's people, and all of that is leading up to what event that we celebrate in December, or we recognize in December. That's Hanukkah, right? Everything that Antiochus does is leading up to those events. And look at also some of the things that this prince has done. This little horn. It's set itself up to be as great as the prince of the host. It took away from him the daily offering, and the place of his sanctuary was thrown down. Right? So those are talking about elements within the temple function and service. The host was given over along with the daily sacrifice. So that's one reason why I was thinking about the host being the people, or particularly the priests. Was given over along with the daily sacrifice. In the course of its rebellion, it will hurl truth to the ground and prosper in what it does. So again, this is identifying that the temple has been functioning at this time. The priesthood has been functioning, and the horn stops the daily sacrifices and desecrated the temple. Many priests would have been killed. The truth being thrown to the ground. What happens to the Torah during this time period? Isn't it declared illegal? Wasn't it made to where they were not allowed to read it? It was outlawed, it was confiscated, it was destroyed. The truth was thrown to the ground. Okay? So Daniel, he sees all of this. And remember, this is 2 to 3 years after the first dream in chapter 7. Here, the ram and the goat, they correspond to the second and third beast from chapter 7. The bear is Persia. The leopard, interestingly enough, has 4 wings, which move very quickly, moved toward the 4 winds, and it also had 4 heads, if you remember that. So there's some consistency in these dreams and these visions. And this is all written before the historical events actually occurred. And no doubt, all of this surely disturbed Daniel. But there are some things that should have encouraged him. Because in his day, when he would have been writing this, were the Jewish people back in Jerusalem at all? Nope. Was there a temple there? Nope. He should have seen something about that. It's like, wait a minute. how could he stop the daily sacrifice if there's not a temple? So he should have had a clue or an idea that the temple was going to be back and restored and functioning. I hope he noticed those things, that those things had to be true in order for the vision to come to pass. And that should have been exciting for him, but at the same time, he's seeing these events happen all over again, and these are events that he has already witnessed once. He's already witnessed the fall of Jerusalem before he was taken into captivity. He was already in Babylon when the temple was destroyed in 586. And he would have to see all those things and be thinking, you mean it's going to all be happening again? How can this happen again? And see, that's one thing about biblical prophecy. They often have multiple fulfillments. They have an immediate context, but they also have a future context. And we'll see more about that in a minute. But, Daniel was reassured, I guess you could say, that this was not a permanent situation. So he sees the vision. He sees how they stop the daily sacrifice. They hurl the truth to the ground, but it's not permanent. It says in verse 13, "Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who was speaking, 'How long will the vision last? The daily sacrifice be forsaken because of rebellion, the sanctuary be surrendered, and the host be trampled.' And then he said to me, 'For 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary will be vindicated.'" Now, I'm not one that likes to get too wrapped up in all the numbers and things like that. But the important thing to come away with this is that all of these have limits. All of this time of trampling, all of this stuff is only for a limited time. The situation will not endure. But when you look at the numbers a little bit, 2,300 days with a biblical lunar calendar of 360 days gets you just over 6 years. And so that's about the time period that Antiochus was overrunning Jerusalem and such. But there's also, mentioned before, this time period, this number 2,300 mentions evenings and mornings, right? I.e. the daily sacrifices. So in some ways you could cut that in half to 1,150 days, which is just over 3 years. So there's different ways of looking at it. Again, the important thing is that there is a limited time. It's time set by the true authority. That's God himself. And he is not going to tolerate this kind of behavior forever. So there are limits to what is allowed. And so Daniel then begins to receive the explanation. But it also is something that opens up other things for us to consider. When you start at verse 15, it says, "Now it happened that while I, Daniel, was watching the vision and trying to understand it, behold, standing before me was one with the appearance of a man. Then I heard a human voice coming between the banks of the Ulai, calling out, saying, 'Gabriel, make this man understand the vision.' And he came near to where I was standing, and as he approached, I was terrified and fell on my face. But he said to me, 'Son of man, understand that the vision pertains to the time of the end.'" Okay? Gabriel is one of only 2 angels named or messengers from God in Scripture. And he comes and explains this situation to Daniel. But the last thing that he says creates a challenge for us. So far, this vision we've talked about it in terms of historical events that have already taken place, that have already been seen and occurred. And it finds its fulfillment in the near future, relatively near future, Persia, then Greece, Alexander, after a couple hundred years. And so often we interpret this passage solely in light of those historical events. But that's not what Gabriel wants Daniel to focus on. He says this pertains to the time of the end. So it's not the only time, well, the word end, pronounced kates, the kof and the thadi, it's end or at the end is talking about a border or something that comes after. It comes from the Hebrew word which means to chop off, like you're cutting off a hand or cutting off your hair or your fingernails and things like that, or you're cutting it in pieces, or you're cutting something to a specific length, or even to shorten something. Right? And that's some of the language that is used in the New Testament. You know, that there's this great deception that's coming, and were these days not cut short, they would deceive even who? Even the elect, if possible, right? So it uses that same kind of language. So it's talking about, these are pertaining to the time of the end. And it's not the only time it uses that kind of language. Verse 18, it says, "While he was speaking to me, I fell into a deep sleep with my face to the ground, but he touched me and stood me up and said, 'Behold, I am going to inform you about what will happen later in the time of wrath. For the vision pertains to the appointed time, the moed, of the end.'" Again, it has a different context than just the immediate historical fulfillment. Moed, of course, is that appointed time, that place, that meeting, the sacred season or feast day. It's that same word, but it's that designated time. And of course, even Yeshua talked about no one knows the day or the hour, only who? Only the Father. There is a set time, an appointed time of the day of the Lord. And he's saying that's what this is really referring to. It says it again in verse 26. "Now the vision of the evenings and mornings that has been told to you is true, but seal up the vision, for it concerns many days from now." It's way off in the future. And it's supposed to be closed up. You know, Antiochus and all those things happening with Hanukkah was about 400 years later from Daniel's life. But that was clearly, that's not the end. That's not the days of wrath. That's not what we are still waiting for. You know, it was not the day of the Lord when all kingdoms are overthrown and only God's kingdom remains. But those events that are fulfilled historically in Antiochus, leading up to Hanukkah, and that restoration, that rededication of the temple, they must reveal something about what's coming. They must give us some kind of insight into the future that we can expect. So when he says this, "I heard the Holy One speaking. Another Holy One said to the one who was speaking, 'How long will the vision last? The daily sacrifice be forsaken?' Or other translations will say, literally, it's made desolate. 'Because of rebellion, the sanctuary be surrendered and the host be trampled.'" Okay, this statement introduces something that we see in chapter 9 and also in the New Testament and such that is called the Abomination of Desolation. Y'all familiar with that term? A little bit, maybe. But when Yeshua mentions this in Matthew chapter 24, all right, he brings up this subject of the Abomination of Desolations. His listeners thought of this as only as an event that has already happened. They would have listened to the idea of the Abomination of Desolation and they say, "Yeah, we've seen that already. That was Hanukkah. We celebrate that. We've done that already." But Yeshua spoke of it in terms of an event that they haven't seen yet. "This good news of the kingdom shall be proclaimed in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come." So when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, and then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. All right? They were like, man, we've already seen that. That's already happened. Antiochus was here at the Temple Mount. He has already desecrated the temple. We've seen all that happen already. So there was a past fulfillment of this moment, but there's also something else to come. And some of this was fulfilled in 70 AD with the fall of the temple, coupled with the destruction of Jerusalem in about 135. But has the end come yet? No. It's not done yet. There are still things that are to be fulfilled. Some of these events described give us insight into things that have yet to happen. It's kind of like a template, a shadow of the things that are come. Again, that's language that we see in the New Testament about the feast in the book of Colossians. Their shadow pointing us to Messiah. The book of Hebrews talks about these things as well. It's also kind of like Ephesians 5. When he's using these symbols, he's using these ideas and these concepts to talk about something else. Ephesians 5, he talks about husbands and wives, right? The relationship between husbands and wives. But what does he say? He says, this is a mystery, but I'm talking about Christ and the church, about the Messiah and his community. So these things can also refer to other things that are still to come. He says, in verse 20, he says, the ram that you saw with the two horns stands for the kings of Media and Persia. The buck, the male goat, is the king of Greece, and the large horn between his eyes is the first king. So if nothing else, this should give us some insight into who some of the players should be. Who are some of the important people, some of the important territories that we should keep our eye on? We should be paying attention, that's out of order, to Persia, right? Which is modern day Iran. Are things happening in Iran these days that we need to be paying attention to? Yes. Going all the way back to many years, they've been a great sponsor of terrorism and such for a while. President Obama tried to make a deal with them about preventing them from getting nuclear weapons. There's still a whole lot of people concerned about that possibility. There's a lot of things happening in Iran. What's interesting about this is when we talk about Greece, the Hebrew is the word Yavan, and he is one of the descendants of Noah, grandson from Japheth. But it's also translated as Ionia. So this is what we typically look at as Greece. This is the modern Greece today, primarily. This over here is Turkey. But I want to focus on this right here, because it's also translated Ionia. I'm going to zoom in right here. Can y'all see that? This territory over here is called what? Ionia. Ionia is what is known as the western side of Turkey. And when you look at this map again, this is talking about the different languages of Greek, or different dialects of Greek. So it starts over here, it controls all of these islands and all of this territory up here. Most of this is still under the control of Turkey today. So Ionia is really not so... It includes this maybe, but it's mostly talking about Turkey over here. That's the modern map. I don't know if you can see this very well. But this is where Persia comes from, here in Iran. This is Babylon and some of these areas over here between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This is Syria. And this is that Ionia right over here, which is modern day Turkey. Y'all following me? So those are some of the players that we need to be watching and paying attention to. We need to keep our eyes on what these guys are doing, which is Iran and Iraq and Turkey, both of whom are fighting for control over Syria. They're both trying to control that territory, from which they can descend from the north. Once they get control of this, they can go where? Right here. All right? All of this is just as the Scripture describes about things coming down from the north. Ezekiel 38 and 39. You see that in Revelation. Okay, so all of this is giving us an idea of the players. Verse 22 says, the four horns that replace the one that was broken represent four kingdoms that will arise from this nation, though not with its power. So there's going to be a lot of political upheaval, divisions of leadership, things like that. We should expect to see that kind of thing. It says, now toward the end of their reign, when the measure of transgressions is completed, a stern-faced king, a master of intrigue, will arise. So transgression is completed, a time of sin and trespass, which is cut short. Much like the sins of the Amorites, if you go back and you read in Genesis, the sins of the Amorites had not reached their full measure. And that's why the Israelites were staying 400 years in Egypt before they were brought out and then used as an instrument of judgment against the Amorites. You also see it kind of in Romans chapter 11, while the Gentiles trample, there is a partial hardening of Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in, until that time is completed. And as that time approaches, we see this is described as a stern-faced king. This could be a man, this could be a nation, but he's also a master of intrigue. So a stern-faced man means he's kind of dangerous, right? He's going to be pretty harsh. He's going to be pretty hard on people. But because he's a master of intrigue, are people going to recognize it at first? Not at first. He's kind of like those situations where you see where people talk about abusive husbands or serial killers or things like that. What do they always say about them? But he's always so nice in public. Right? Y'all heard that before? Every time you see them, they're always such a nice person. A master of intrigue. On the surface, on the outside, he's going to appear friendly and helpful, but he will be destructive. His power will be mighty, but it will not be by his strength alone. So he's going to use all sorts of different methods to accomplish his goals. He will cause extraordinary devastation and succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy both the powerful and the holy people. So we should expect there to be a lot of destruction with this person. We should expect that what's going to happen to opposition, people that oppose him, or nations that go against him. Again, this is either a nation, a person, or a nation. We should expect that opposition is going to be taken out. We should expect that the holy people become the target. Just like what we read about in Revelation, where those who persist, those who endure, are those who keep the commandments of God, as well as those who hold to the testimony of Yeshua. There's the Jewish people who are keeping the commandments of God, and then you have those that are holding to the testimony of Yeshua. Those are the believing disciples and things. And then it's also a greater danger for those who try to do both. Everything that we are seeing in our day, everything in the news about increasing hostility and persecution should not surprise us at all. We should expect these kinds of things to happen. Because this guy, or this nation, they'll make themselves look like the hero, and they'll make the believers look like the villains. They'll make the Jewish people look like the villains. Anything like that happening these days? Yeah, there's a lot of that going on. And it's increasing. It says, by his cunning he will cause deceit to prosper. So we should expect to see more and more of that. The lies will increase, greater attempts to deceive, becoming more and more brazen and outlandish. Deceit, but it's going to prosper. So all sorts of deceit, as crazy as things get, are people still going to believe it? Yes. Can we look around our country and look at some of the things that people are saying and people are believing, and you look at it and you say, how in the world are people falling for this stuff? Right? We should expect that kind of stuff. And people are going to believe it so much that this leader is going to think that he can do whatever he wants. So he'll cause deceit to prosper under his hand, and he will consider himself superior. Man, I'm just above all of you peons down there. I'm better than all of you people down there. The rules are for you, they're not really for me. Right? I'm going to make you do certain things and wear the masks or whatever else, but when I don't feel like it, I don't have to. When I want to take all of this stuff with the Green New Deal, energy, stuff like that, restricting of travel, all those kinds of things, that's for us. That's not for them. Right? He'll think he is superior. He will essentially walking in pride. And he'll look like he can never be defeated. And many will lose hope, and many will fall away because he is succeeding in everything that he does. But again, what has Daniel already established for those that walk in pride? He's already established what's going to happen, that they will be humbled, as chapter 4 establishes. Chapter 7 establishes that the Ancient of Days will take his seat on the throne, and the books will be opened, and the saints of God, the people of God, will take possession of the kingdom. Those are the things that have not happened yet. The good news of the kingdom is that the kingdom of this earth, all of the kingdoms of the earth are going to pass away. But what about his word? Is his word going to pass away? Are the outcomes of these dreams and visions going to pass away? No, they're not. So we should never take our eyes off of that truth. That no matter what we see happening in all of this stuff, his kingdom is coming. Yeshua will descend in power and glory at the sounding of the shofar. We don't understand it all. We can't see it all. We don't know the exact timing of all of these things. But none of this stuff should be surprising us. Because some of these things, as he said earlier, have been sealed up until the time of the end. Hello. He will destroy many, taking them unaware. He will even stand up against the prince of princes, yet he will be broken. But not by human hands. It's not going to be our military that defeats this situation. It's going to be him. I am missing some things. Hello, that shouldn't be there. The vision of the evenings and mornings that has been told to you is true, but seal it up. Seal up the vision, for it concerns many days from now. So no matter what we see happening in our days ahead, we should not let it cause us to lose hope or cause us to lose faith. Because many people are struggling. They are struggling with what we see going on, what we've seen already, what they are afraid they're going to see. And even Daniel struggled with that. Again, this is another example. After the vision in chapter 7, he struggled. And then the vision after chapter 8, he's also struggling. Then I, Daniel, was stricken and languished for days. And then I got up and went about the king's business. So he continued to live. He continued to live and operate and function because that got him out of that languishing. I got up and went about the king's business, but I was astounded at the vision, and no one could explain it. And it's strange that he says that because he just got it explained to him. He was just given the interpretation of the dream. But even he struggled with all of this, with coming to terms with it, with being overwhelmed with what the sense of negativity that can so easily happen. But you and I, those of us who believe, those of us who have the Holy Spirit in our hearts, we're not supposed to grieve like those who have no hope. Neither are we supposed to be fearful like those who have no hope. What we need are reminders of what God has done. We need reminders of what He has done so we can have confidence in what He is going to do. We need to remember how He has delivered in the past to help us establish our trust for Him in the future that He has promised. And it's a good thing that we have something like that coming up. Just this week. Because is all of this that is taking place in our day, all this stuff that's going on, is it a big deal? Yeah. Now, you shouldn't pretend that it's not. Is it going to be chaotic and dangerous even for the people of God? Yes. So we must prepare ourselves in our spirit for this kind of truth. We've got to hold on to these things so that we're not caught off guard or shaken our confidence, creating in us greater fear and anxiety. We need reminders. And that's what Passover is really supposed to be. This day is to be a memorial for you. You are to keep it as a feast to Adonai throughout your generations. You are to keep it as an eternal ordinance. Verse 24, he says, also you are to observe this event as an eternal ordinance for you and your children. When you come into the land which Adonai will give you as He has promised you, you are to keep this ceremony. Now when it happens that your children ask you, what does this ceremony mean to you? You are to say, it is the sacrifice of Adonai's Passover, because He passed over the houses of Bnei Israel in Egypt, when He struck down the Egyptians, but spared our households. So the people bowed their heads and worshipped. Then Bnei Israel went and did it. They did just as Adonai commanded Moses and Aaron. In chapter 12, verse 42, it says, it was a night of watching for Adonai to bring them out of the land of Egypt. And this same night is a night of vigil for Adonai, for all Bnei Israel throughout their generations. So why is Passover important and necessary? Because we have been made a part of this people. We have been delivered from the dominion of darkness. We have been taken out of Egypt and delivered into the kingdom of the Son. We have been made part of the commonwealth of Israel. And so we are citizens and not foreigners. We are essentially part of that mixed multitude that has been redeemed with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. And we need to remember all of these things. We need to be reminded of what the Father has done for His people so that we can remember and trust and keep in mind what He will do for His people. Because when we trust in what He has done, we will be better equipped to trust Him for what is coming. Does that make sense? Okay, I know that was a lot. But that's chapter 8. A night of watching. And that's what we need. We need reminders that will carry us through all of the difficult times that may be coming our way.